bring you news beyond your borders. The United States has terminated a Zimbabwe sanctions program and reimposed curbs on 9 individuals and 3 entities. Fresh sanctions have been imposed on President Emmerson Mnangagwa, the First Lady Auxillia Mnangagwa, the Vice President Constantino Chiwenga, and other senior officials. The United States Treasury's office, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, accuses them of being involved in corruption and serious human rights abuses. Let's bring in Chris Maroleng. He is Africa 360 Advisory's CEO, for some analysis on these latest developments. Chris, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. The Secretary of State calls it part of a stronger, more targeted sanctions policy. What do you make of these new sanctions?
Good afternoon, Michelle. Thank you for having me on your program. Certainly, it is a very interesting development coming from the United States, which seems to be planning to introduce more targeted sanctions, as you indicated, against 9 individuals and 3 entities. This will make it difficult for these individuals to travel to the United States and certainly to other jurisdictions, but more importantly, to transact. And we understand from the United States that these sanctions were imposed really as a means to enhance accountability and transparency in terms of governance in that country, which has been significantly in decline, particularly after the controversial contested elections that were held last year. Michelle, I think the interesting aspect about this that we need to take out of it is that the global Magnitsky sanctions program, under which these new targeted sanctions are brought into place, this will be the first time that a head of state in the form of Emmerson Mnangagwa is sanctioned under this new sanctions regime, which the United States has been using to basically coordinate its sanctions program.
You know, the question always becomes, Chris, given what's emerged and what has been known for quite some time insofar as the quashing of opposition politics in a country like Zimbabwe, multiple cases of abductions, physical abuse, unlawful killings have left citizens living in fear. This is also a statement from the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. It raises the question again about what neighboring countries, and South Africa perhaps is chief among them, just given how many Zimbabweans have fled to this country. Have we done enough insofar as the diplomatic means that we have available to us?
Certainly not, Michelle, and I think one of the key things that our government is at pains to point out, that is the South African government is at pains to point out, is that Zimbabwe is a sovereign state. And it is very difficult for them, in a sense, to impose punitive measures in the way that many of us would anticipate the South African government to engage in. Having said so, I think one of the key things that the South African government has been successful in doing is keeping the door open, especially with the governing ZANU-PF. The ANC and ZANU-PF do have historical links, and we have seen messages and engagement going through that channel in particular. But certainly one would hope that we would see, particularly at this time, heightened diplomatic action, like the action that we have seen the South African government engage in when it comes to the question in Israel, and how they have taken it upon themselves to really call upon the Israeli government to change and move away from their potentially genocidal activities that they've been engaged in.
Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. And, you know, what feeds into whether we decide to make statements like that and when we don't? I mean, there are various other incidents on the continent as well, insofar as gay rights is concerned, for example, where we've also chosen to stay mum.
Yes. I think one of the key considerations, especially from a South African foreign policy perspective, is that the South African government has been at pains also to point out that they like to operate through the sub-regional body, that is the Southern African Development Community, and also the Pan-African body, the African Union, when it comes to engaging with their counterparts on the African continent. This in many ways has limited the ability of South Africa to really engage in a more robust approach towards tackling some of these challenging questions that face the continent. For example, in Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where South Africa has also deployed a contingent under the auspices of the Southern African Development Community, and prior to that, the United Nations. So in essence, we are seeing South Africa taking steps. However, in many ways, their multilateral approach to things has meant that the diplomatic engagement has often been complex and underpinned by respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, but more importantly, the fact of solidarity amongst maybe African governments has been one of the key things that has made maybe South Africa's foreign policy in many parts of the continent lack in the sort of teeth that we would have expected.
Well, speaking of teeth, there is also the toothless or toothful nature of AU and SADC, which perhaps we'll have another discussion on at another time. But Chris, you know, I remember the inauguration of Emmerson Mnangagwa in 2017, and one does also feel, insofar as the US and its relations with Zimbabwe is concerned, that there were those hopes, brief hopes of a thawing of those relations, and perhaps some hope for the people of Zimbabwe as well. At that stadium in 2017, I was in the anchor chair at the time. I forget the name of the stadium now, but it was very short-lived, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I believe it was the National Sports Stadium in Harare.
Yes.
And the interesting thing around that inauguration is that that period did usher in a time when many of us believed that there would be a set of reforms introduced. It really takes us back to the matter at hand here, Michelle, which is around the sanctions regime. These sanctions really should be seen as a tool to implement the overarching U.S. policy towards Zimbabwe, which is described as ZIDERA, which is the Zimbabwe Democracy, Reconstruction and Economic Act, which is the overarching policy introduced by Congress as an act, which basically determines the United States policy towards Zimbabwe, and the fact that they want to reintroduce greater democracy, that is accountability, transparency. They would like to see reforms that see a reconstruction of Zimbabwe's economy, which has been faltering for quite some years now. Challenge with this is that the ZIDERA Act in and of itself and the sanctions that were introduced about 2 decades ago led to a strategic articulation or narrative by Zimbabwe, which said that the economic decline in Zimbabwe, the political malaise that we've seen in that country, emanates mainly due to Western interference, the United States, the EU and other actors from the West. And now the fact that these sanctions have been lifted really has been a smart strategic move by the United States to basically say that we're now targeting these sanctions. They are much tighter, much stronger, focused on specified individuals designated under this new sanctions regime. Now, this basically means, Michelle, that maybe the narrative from Harare will change ever so slightly, where they'll start to say that, well, if you have sanctions against our top leadership in Zimbabwe, you might as well have kept the old sanctions in place. So it's going to be interesting to see what the reaction and the immediate response to this from Harare will be. And we can anticipate that the normal vitriol around Western interference will be underpinning element of this approach.
And we might also ask the question, you know, do these sanctions now put an economy that is already under severe pressure under the hammer even more? And I suppose the U.S. response to that would be that the economy of any country is the responsibility of that country.
That's right. And ultimately, I would really say that the decline that we have seen in Zimbabwe's economy has really been man-made. It has been as a result of bad governance that has eroded investor confidence in that country. It has also emanated, or rather generated, a situation in that country where people have chosen to vote with their feet because they do not believe in the efficacy of their electoral system. Many of them find themselves in South Africa, where we see millions of Zimbabweans coming here as economic refugees. So ultimately, the people who have undermined the economy in Zimbabwe has been the government of that country, who have introduced policies that have not resulted in the kind of investor confidence and economic stability that will see the sort of investment coming into Zimbabwe.
So what do we hope will come out of these sanctions, Chris? Because the U.S. will say as well, and I think this was a statement that was made by the Deputy Treasury Secretary in the U.S. The changes, this is a quote, "The changes we are making today are intended to make clear what has always been true. Our sanctions are not intended to target the people of Zimbabwe." That might be true. That might be the intention. The reality, I imagine, is different, Chris.
Yeah, the reality is different in the sense that what we witness on the ground in Zimbabwe is a faltering opposition, an opposition that has ultimately all but collapsed in that country. And this is mainly due to the operating environment and some strategic mistakes that have been made by opposition leaders in that country. Secondary to that has been the lack of effective governance that has been really the trade in stock of the governing party in that country, which has been ZANU-PF. There has only been one party in charge in that country. And I think our analysis has also been slightly off in the sense that we have not condemned the fact that in 2017 there was a military coup that saw President Robert Mugabe being kicked out unconstitutionally from office. A lot of people thought any change would be as good as a holiday. But as we have discovered, the corruption, the human rights abuses have continued even under this new regime of Emmerson Mnangagwa. There has not been an improvement in the economic situation. Some argue, in actual fact, that the economy has worsened. So our view is that what needs to happen in Zimbabwe is a comprehensive set of reforms that are not focused on any one political party. A transition must be put into place where maybe some kind of government of national unity that can act in the interest of Zimbabweans can be put into place. This, in our view, will ultimately sort out the structural issues which have yet to be addressed in Zimbabwe.